Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry to interrupt your conversations, but we are really thrilled that you're finding opportunities to chat and talk with each other. I'm sure a few more people will be joining us as we get going. But on behalf of the journal and the organisers of the conference, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first keynote of the conference. I will do a kind of formal introduction for Professor Prasad in just a moment, but I've done a little bit of housekeeping today already, but let me go through a few of those bits again. We just want to remind you to put your phones on silent, if that's okay. The event is being recorded, I believe, or at least I think it might be. I'm looking for Yadna, actually. I can't see her. Anyway, maybe not. We'll see. But at the end, there'll be a chance for questions, and so we will have folks that will be coming round to help with microphones, and so just wait for them to come to you before you ask your questions. Monica has asked, actually, that at the end, if we have lots of hands, I'm going to try and collect all the questions so that we can get the feedback together. So if you do have a burning question, then put up your hand, and we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. Monica Prasad is Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economic and Political Sociology at Johns Hopkins University, was previously Professor of Sociology at Northwestern, and the winner of multiple awards, including the extremely prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, which is offered to individuals who have demonstrated distinguished accomplishment in their field. Her work spans economic sociology, comparative, historical sociology, and political sociology. And in pursuing these modes of inquiry, has sought to understand the political economy of the United States, as well as other advanced industrial nations. She is the award-winning author of 4 books. She's won the Barrington Moore Book Award twice, as well as the American Sociological Association's Distinguished Scholarly Book Award. Her work has been personally important to me in 2 ways that I'll just touch on very briefly. The first was in the context of the Great Recession and austerity in Europe. I was working on the political economy of health and the impacts of austerity, and her work on fiscal sociology and taxes in particular helped me think carefully about some of the challenges facing Europe at that moment. And more recently, I was running a research group a few years ago, and I remember discussing together the article that became the book that we'll hear a bit about tonight on problem-solving sociology. And I think what's important about this, among many other reasons, is that Professor Prasad articulates a way to combine indignation, perhaps, with careful theorizing, to bring together animating concern for the world with methodological rigor. If, she argues, sociology is really the study of society, it should have something to say about how to change society too. And so we're fortunate then to hear Professor Prasad reflect on how to apply this vision of problem-solving sociology to the protectionist turn in American society and its links with populism. So please join me in welcoming Professor Prasad to give our keynote.
Thank you, Aaron, for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed the panels that I have seen, and this is an honor. So, some years ago, I wrote a book called Problem-Solving Sociology, which argues that sociology should try to solve social problems rather than just describe them. That trying to solve a problem not only has practical implications, but is also an intellectual challenge that can push at the borders of what we understand. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of what's in the book, whenever you say problem-solving sociology, the first thing any sociologist will say is, well, who gets to decide what the problem is? And so I spend a whole chapter trying to answer that question. And then I talk about some research designs from problem solving, give some exercises, etc. And then I spend an entire chapter going through objections that people have to this kind of exercise. Why we shouldn't do this, this is too incremental, we really need to overthrow capitalism, or this is too technocratic, or we shouldn't be activist at all. So I'm happy to have this discussion in Q&A, but if your objection doesn't get answered during the course of this session, please know that it's probably answered somewhere in the book. Now, it turns out that I'm not the only person making arguments like this. Completely independently from me, many sociologists have been saying similar things. Duncan Watts is a sociologist who argues social science should be more solution-oriented. Recently, the journal Sociology did a whole symposium on how we might think of trying to solve inequality rather than just describe it. In this first article, Adam Gamaran writes, quote, "Inequality has long been a central focus of sociological research, but some argue that sociology as a discipline has actually done little to reduce inequality in society." And these other articles in the symposium then try to pick up that challenge and try to think about how to reduce inequality. Recently, the European Economic Sociology section has suggested that economic sociology should take what they call a positive turn. I was a little bit puzzled by this phrase when I first heard of it, positive turn, because we might think of the words normative and positive, in which positivist means the exact opposite of trying to find solutions. I think where this is coming out of is an analogy with positive psychology. So positive psychology is about leaving behind a focus on psychological illness and focusing on things like what makes people resilient, what makes them flourish. So similarly, they want to develop a positive economic sociology. In fact, even the Social Science Research Council, which is the preeminent organization of social science research in the US, has said we ought to be doing research to solve social problems. So there's a lot of interest in this. It's kind of the general vibe right now. I think there are a few different reasons for why we're seeing all this, internal reasons as well as external reasons. One is there's clearly a little bit of frustration with the state of the world today. There is a sense that social science ought to have something to say about that. I think also internally in sociology, there are reasons internal to the discipline this is happening. One is I think there's a frustration with what sometimes seems like endless description and redescription and new labels for social phenomena. In political science and economics, I think there's a frustration with the methods, that if you can't find a perfect quasi-experimental design, then you can't actually study the question. So there are these various internal things that are happening as well. And there's also something interesting that has happened in our understanding of the history and sociology of science. And that is that scholars have started to suggest that this binary division that we have in our minds between pure research and applied research doesn't really map onto how research often works. There's this very interesting book called Pasteur's Quadrant by the political scientist Donald Stokes. He says you can think of research as divided along two lines. One is, are there considerations of use? Is it applied research that is concerned with questions or problems in the world? And the other is there a quest for fundamental understanding? So you might think of Niels Bohr and his research on the basic structure of atoms as pure basic research. On the other hand, you might think of someone like Thomas Edison trying to figure out how to make a light bulb as pure applied research. And then Stokes suggests there is this interesting quadrant in the upper right here that he calls Pasteur's Quadrant, which is research that begins by grappling with actual problems in the world and then ends by revising our theories of what we think we know about the world. So Louis Pasteur starts out trying to figure out why a certain kind of alcohol was souring. And in pursuing that investigation, he ends up producing new knowledge about the germ theory of disease, use-inspired basic research. Another recent example is the CRISPR technology, which began partly as a way to figure out how to make better yogurt. So in sociology, you can think of respondent-driven sampling techniques, which are born in trying to figure out how to reach hard-to-reach populations like drug users. So the point here is that if we're actually investigating a social problem and trying to solve it, we are forced again and again to confront the limits of our intellectual understanding and to try to push past those limits. This empty quadrant, by the way, on the lower left, some people call that tinkering. I think of the Victorian amateur scientists and naturalists here in England who were cataloging nature for the fun of it, in which my former colleague Joel Mokyr says were part of the reason for the Industrial Revolution. And by the way, the Pasteur's Quadrant has become so popular that you can even buy t-shirts with it, although I think that you really haven't arrived as a scientist until you're featured in a cartoon in XKCD. But the basic idea here is that a quest for understanding is not something that you put aside when you start trying to solve social problems. And so I'll just briefly mention that in the years since I wrote the book, we have been developing an infrastructure to help scholars who want to try solving problems in sociology. We have a website where we coordinate various events, problemsolvingsociology.com. We have a Center on Global Poverty at Johns Hopkins that takes this problem-solving approach and tries to apply it to the specific problem of global poverty. Cambridge University Press is going to be doing a book series on problem-solving sociology. You can find information on all of this at problemsolvingsociology.com. Okay, so one of the main questions I get from people who have not read the book is that problem solving is too narrow. They think it's all about small technocratic solutions rather than big structural change. So I thought what I would do in the bulk of this talk is show how I'm struggling with one of the biggest problems, the problem of populism in America. And of course, populism is something that's happening all over the world, but it's taken this unusually protectionist form in the US. And because of the weight of the US in the world, it's created a problem for the whole world right now. So I'm going to shift gears and actually try to struggle with this problem. I won't solve it, but I'll try to show you how intellectually interesting it can be to try to solve the problem. So this is what economists used to say about whether globalization is something to worry about. They used to say that we shouldn't be so concerned about globalization because globalization is not really what's behind the long-term decline in the manufacturing sector. So on this chart, this is manufacturing as a share of employment in the US. You can see where the North American Free Trade Agreement comes in, and then this is when China enters the World Trade Organization. These two big shocks of globalization for the US don't really change the trajectory of manufacturing very much. Economists also used to point out that this is what the decline looks like between 1979 and 2023. We lost around 7 million manufacturing jobs. But in that same time, we gained around 60 million jobs overall. So it's not clear why this relatively small decline, really a net gain in jobs, should have had such an outsized effect. That was the picture that we used to have. More recently, I think it's fair to say that there has been a sea change in the understanding about this issue in the discipline of economics, occasioned by the works of David Otter and David Dorn and Gordon Hanson and their colleagues. So they say, quote, "We find strong evidence that congressional districts exposed to larger increases in import competition disproportionately removed moderate representatives from office in the 2000s. Trade-exposed districts initially in Republican hands became substantially more likely to elect a conservative Republican, while trade-exposed districts initially in Democratic hands became more likely to elect either a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican." Across several works, they have made this argument that globalization has had important political effects because although there was a net gain in jobs, the job losses were concentrated, and those who lost the jobs were not the same as those who got the new jobs. But then that brings us back to this chart and to the question, why was it not possible to help this small number of people get some of these 60 million jobs? Why wasn't it possible to compensate the losers of free trade? Especially because the need for compensation to those harmed by trade is well known. One of the main papers that brings this idea into American economics in the 1940s by Stolper and Samuelson says, nobody, of course, ever denied that the workers employed in industry which loses a tariff could be hurt in the short run. The harm which free trade inflicts upon one factor of production is necessarily less than the gain to the other. Hence, it is always possible to bribe the suffering factor by subsidy or other redistributive devices so as to leave all factors better off as a result of trade. So then the question of this project is, why didn't or couldn't we bribe the suffering factor? Why couldn't we compensate those who lost out from free trade? I'm not going to give a full answer to this question. A full answer would involve things like the difficulty of relocating people, the rise of female labor force participation, etc. I do specifically want to talk about this specific question of compensation and adjustment. Given that it's 7 million losses versus 60 million gains, why couldn't we compensate the 7 million? I'm going to examine a specific episode in American history in this talk, but this question of compensation and adjustment has many implications for today. One is because of the continuing rise of trade. We had the China shock, but other areas of the world are also developing and will also export and will also trade. So this continues to be an issue. In addition, there's displacement caused by the fossil fuel transition, the kind of thing that Rebecca studies. So one estimate is that we'll lose 2.4 million jobs, but we'll gain 12 million jobs. And of course, if we didn't know the manufacturing story, we would say nothing to worry about. We have a net gain of almost 10 million jobs, but we do know the manufacturing story. It matters who gets the jobs and what happens to those who lose the jobs. And of course, adjustment is a huge question now for AI job dislocation. So I'm going to explore a historical episode in American history that has implications for all of these things. The story starts with the junior senator from Massachusetts in the 1950s, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy is deeply implicated in the debates about free trade and compensating losers of free trade. First, because the Massachusetts textile industry at this time is not doing well. It's already been decimated by textile jobs moving south, and then in the 1950s, what's left of it is destroyed by Japan. The last textile mill in Lowell, which is this famous site of industrialization in America, closes in the 1950s. So Kennedy is very aware of what trade can do. At the same time, this is a period in American history when the memory of Depression-era protectionism is still very fresh. Memory of Smoot-Hawley is very fresh. This was the Depression-era Protectionist Act that was blamed at the time for worsening the Depression. So just to give you a sense of the period, American labor unions are pro-free trade at this point. The AFL-CIO, the UAW are all pro-free trade. There are concerns in the US about the beginnings of European integration at this time. There are worries that American exporters will be blocked out of this vast integrating market. And then there are geopolitical concerns as well. So here's a quote, for example, from an editorial in The Atlantic. Recently, we risked a world war in Korea in order, among other things, not to leave Japan exposed to communist aggression, but we're apparently willing to risk the loss of Japan to the free world in order not to leave American textile mills and garment manufacturers, all of whom hold themselves out to be defenders of free enterprise, exposed to Japanese competition. So free trade winds are blowing for a lot of different reasons. And at this time, the idea of compensating the losers of free trade is on the agenda. This is the Randall Commission. It was a presidential commission headed by Clarence Randall. Looks like I don't have a pointer, but Clarence Randall is in front here talking to President Eisenhower, who's the one on the bottom right. And then there are representatives of labor as well as capital in this picture. Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, is in the picture. Can you find him? He looks exactly like George H.W. Bush. He's on the right in the middle row. And then two to the left of Prescott Bush is David McDonald. He's the president of the U.S. Steelworkers Unions. And he's the one who, as part of this commission, is credited with coming up with the idea of trade adjustment assistance, which is compensation to workers who lose their jobs because of free trade. So exactly the kind of bribing the suffering factor that the economists are telling us to do, right? Kennedy, as a senator, is very interested in this approach. He proposes it several times in the 1950s. It's not successful then, but over the course of the 1950s, it becomes more popular, including among business groups, especially moderate business groups, such as the Committee for Economic Development. If you've read the work of the sociologist Mark Mizrachi, you're familiar with some of these people, these moderate business groups. So it's an interesting moment in American history. You have business on board with this trade adjustment trade adjustment assistance idea. You have labor on board. This is basically an embryonic American corporatism that looks a lot like what was happening in Europe at the time. When Kennedy becomes president, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 is passed, which says an act to promote the general welfare, foreign policy, and security of the U.S. through international trade agreements and through adjustment assistance to domestic industry, agricultural labor, for other purposes. So adjustment assistance is in the title of the act. It was the purpose of the act. So all of this is in place. Labor's on board. Businesses is on board. And then it all falls apart. Between 1962 and the end of 1969, the Tariff Commission, which is in charge of this, rejects every single petition for compensation. So the language of the 1962 Act says these things. It says the Tariff Commission shall promptly make an investigation to determine whether, as a result in major part of concessions granted under trade agreements, an article is being imported into the U.S. in such increased quantities as to cause or threaten to cause serious injury to the domestic industry. Increased imports shall be considered to cause or threaten to cause serious injury when the Tariff Commission finds that such increased imports have been the major factor in causing or threatening to cause such injury. Every single word of this, the Tariff Commission obsessed about. So in major part, serious injury, the major factor. Sometimes they obsessed about the word such. So as an example, in a case about American ceramic products, the Tariff Commission says imports were not the result of trade concessions, but of, quote, rising consumer purchasing power, the increase in the number of families entering the market for higher priced China, the growing demand for low-priced underwear shots, large pieces of which enter the top value category. Industrial biochemicals, the Commission finds that imports were not in such increased quantities to cause or threaten serious injury. National tile and manufacturing, imports are increasing, but not in such quantities. There was injury to petitioner, but not serious injury. In general plywood, the Commission finds that the firm had been harmed by trade in the past, but at the time of filing was no longer being harmed by trade. One issue I go into in more detail in the written version of this is that the Commission has in its mind a picture of trade as another country making the exact same product with lower wages. And then tariffs block that product from coming in. So there's no sense of trade as a dynamic phenomenon. So for example, there was one case involving transistor radios from Japan. The Commission says that American industry is not harmed in this case because Americans were not making the small radios that the Japanese invented. Therefore, it's not the same product, it's a different product. They say, quote, transistor radios were not produced commercially in the United States prior to the middle 1950s. Accordingly, when the concessions referred to were granted, there were no jobs in the manufacture of transistor radios in existence, therefore no jobs to be protected. In fact, these radios decimated American radio manufacturers. But the Commission rules that at the time trade concessions were put in place, these smaller radios did not exist, and therefore the concessions were not put in place against them. So this is not really going very well, this attempt to compensate the losers from trade. All the petitions are rejected until late 1969. And then in the 1970s, partly because of this, labor turns against free trade. I'll just show you some quotes from labor publications. In 1961, the AFL-CIO is saying, the AFL-CIO calls on Congress to enact in 1962 a new trade law which would maximize opportunities for expanding trade. They're on board with free trade. 1963, still, they're saying political opposition to expanded trade grows when no one takes care of problems created by free trade. For the first time, the U.S. has put these principles into national policy. So they're very excited about trade adjustment assistance. By 1967, they're getting frustrated. They're saying the AFL-CIO supported the Trade Expansion Act with the understanding that its continued support for liberal trade policy was based on adequate aid and assistance would be given to those harmed by changing trade patterns. By 1971, they've concluded this is not working. They have become protectionist. The AFL-CIO supports this bill called the Burke-Hartke Bill, which is a protectionist bill demanding import quotas, the first major push for protectionism by labor. An interesting wrinkle that I won't get into in detail is that the United Auto Workers are still free trade at this point, and that's partly because for 3 years in the 1960s, they had a more lenient form of trade adjustment assistance given to auto workers. So they did get the kind of trade adjustment assistance that labor had talked about, and it did seem to do something to make them a little less protectionist. Nevertheless, the 3-year program ended, and the UAW eventually turned protectionist as well. So now labor is protectionist. So Republicans' business turn against adjustment assistance because they're saying, well, trade adjustment isn't doing the main thing that it was supposed to do, which is prevent protectionism in labor. So why should we support it? So they move away from trade adjustment assistance too. This corporatist experiment ends, and this new shareholder value idea starts to emerge. So why did this happen? Why was American corporatism killed in its cradle, this beautiful moment of labor and business cooperation? So first you might ask, thinking of the transistor radio case or these other cases, was the commission partisan? Was it just anti-labor? Is that why they ruled against all the petitions? It doesn't really seem that that was the case. Before 1962, before the Trade Expansion Act, when they were ruling on quotas, they had often found that harm to domestic industry was caused by trade. It does seem that they were genuinely trying to interpret this new language that had been given to them. And they were struggling with this issue that historical sociologists are familiar with, which is about the difficulty of making a case that one specific historical incident was caused by some particular factor. It would be like trying to defend your historical sociology article in court. That's what they were asking. So then you might ask, well, if the commission was just following the rules, were the rules partisan? Were the rules written in such a way to produce this outcome? And it doesn't seem that that's the case either. So you'll remember one of the key sticking points was this language of, as a result, in major part, of concessions granted under trade agreements. This language didn't exist in the original legislation from the House. The language was just, the Tariff Commission shall promptly make an investigation to determine whether, as a result of concessions granted under trade agreements, an article is being imported into the US, etc. The Senate adds this language, shall promptly make an investigation to determine whether, as a result, in major part of concessions, etc. So the question is, why did they add that? Did they knowingly made it harder to qualify? And the strange thing is, they weren't trying to make the rules tighter, they were actually trying to make them looser. So as they explain, they say the bill as it came to the committee might have made it difficult for industries which felt that they had been injured to prove their case. The language of the bill could have been interpreted to mean that the increased imports as a result of concessions were the sole cause of injury. While this may not have been the intent of the bill, the amendment makes it clear the Tariff Commission need find only that the tariff commissions have been the major cause, and such imports have been the major cause of injury. They thought they were loosening the bill. And you might think, well, is this trustworthy? Can we actually believe what they say? It seems so, because the main person guiding this legislation in the Senate and responsible for these amendments was Robert Kerr, sometimes called the uncrowned king of the Senate for that period. He was a free trader. He wanted these policies. He was on Kennedy's side in this. So there doesn't seem to be reason to think that he was trying to destroy it or undermine it with this language. So then you think, well, is it all just contingency? They were trying to loosen it, they ended up tightening it. I think someone could perhaps write an interesting paper on how societies rooted in laws are always subject to the contingency of language. For me, I tend to find these kinds of explanations about contingency unsatisfying. To me, it seems to be an indication of an incomplete explanation. For example, for decades, the scholarship on neoliberalism treated the oil crisis of the early 1970s as just an exogenous shock, a contingency that was just outside our theoretical frameworks. It's really only very recently that the story of how the oil exporting countries discovered their power and how they conceptualized this tool as an anti-imperialist tactic is starting to get told. And it still has not been fully integrated into the understanding of neoliberalism. If we're willing to just accept contingency as the final answer, it prevents us from looking harder to try to understand what's going on. Okay, so if we're not convinced by all that, if they're not a satisfying way to think about it, how should we think about it? So I argue two things explain the events. First is there's a general picture in the social sciences that state capacity helps progressive policies. And in the case of the American welfare state, that does not seem to be true. There's an emerging literature now on how the state gets in the way of the state. A legal scholar named Nicholas Bagley kicked off this attention to what he calls procedural fetishism, this inflexible attempt at making these regulations. And there have been several popular books recently exploring these dynamics. For example, how environmental rules and regulations are used to prevent the building of environmental projects. That's what this book, Abundance, is all about. In some of my earlier work, I've shown how progressive tax policies prevented the rise of a progressive welfare state. So this episode is another in that saga. This is the Tariff Commission building in Washington, D.C. The Tariff Commission is one of these independent, autonomous, meritocratic bureaucracies of exactly the kind that we think of when we think of state capacity. But it was a nonpartisan agency outside the state, unlike the bureaucracies within the state in Europe, and that made coherent policymaking more difficult. The Tariff Commission made these independent decisions inflexibly following rules, whereas in similar situations, European civil servants and diplomats from inside the state might have considered the overarching goals of the policy and considered factors like the need to keep a political coalition together. So this is one more chapter in how the strange structure of the American state undermines social democratic policies. And feeds into contemporary questions about rethinking what state capacity means that are now in the public agenda. And then there's a second lesson, which I think is more transferable to the cases of climate transition and AI labor dislocation. And that's that targeted programs don't work because you can't precisely identify the suffering factor in order to bribe them. That's basically what we see in the trade adjustment story. What you should not do if you're trying to figure out what to do about AI is put together an AI adjustment assistance program that requires that you prove that you've been dislocated by AI, right? Nevertheless, the reason we do targeted programs is because universal programs are so hard to implement. So in the US, after the failure of trade adjustment assistance, Richard Nixon attempted a universal program of worker retraining as part of a broader attempt to reform the welfare state. But every time he made it generous enough to satisfy progressives, it upset conservatives and vice versa. In the 1990s, Robert Reich pushed Bill Clinton in this direction, but after his big healthcare program failed, Clinton concluded he needed to move to the center. In 2012, Barack Obama attempted a universal program of worker retraining. Here's the labor secretary saying, it shouldn't matter whether a layoff is a result of offshoring, downsizing, or a failed business venture. Those who lose a job through no fault of their own should have easy and immediate access to high-quality job search assistance. It's time to turn our unemployment system into a reemployment system, but this didn't go anywhere because of the cost concerns. The upshot is, if you try a narrow, targeted program, it fails because you can't identify the suffering factor. But if you try a universal program, it's too expensive. And especially in the post-1973 period of recession and neoliberalism and austerity, it's been completely impossible to make a case for such programs. Now, I did promise to at least try to solve the problems, so I'll mention that the solution is programs that are universal, because you can't precisely identify who loses from trade, self-financing, offsetting the costs in the long run, and incremental, so that the gains slowly offset the costs. And admittedly, that sounds like a tall order: universal, self-financing, and incremental. Nevertheless, in the US, this might just be possible right now. It's a strange moment in American politics where workers are flocking to the Republican Party. And that means the Republican Party might start to think about programs for workers. And Democrats have historically been a party for workers, and they might also be open to such programs. In fact, there is a program that is moving ahead of this kind around apprenticeships. So this is a chart showing the total apprentice count in the US. Apprenticeships have risen by about 75% in the last 10 years. And they have risen on a bipartisan basis. They arose through the populist years, through the Biden interregnum. Apprenticeships could be universal, self-financing, and incremental. An apprenticeship is where the employer, not a third party such as a university or a community college, trains the employee while the employee is actually working and receiving a salary. And in the comparative political economy literature, apprenticeships are seen as essential to the development of a welfare state. They're very closely tied to European welfare states. Studies suggest that in an apprenticeship, the employer bears the training costs. Studies suggest that they pay for themselves in the long run, helping not just workers but also employers. The difficulty is to get employers unfamiliar with them to pay the initial cost, because employers worry that they will spend money to train a worker who might then leave. Once an apprenticeship system becomes established across an industry, this is less of a worry because all employers share in the cost of trainings and employers see the benefits for themselves. In countries where apprenticeships are widespread, the government does defray the cost, but employers pay most of it. The question is how to get to that point. So it's interesting that given how tightly apprenticeships have been related to the development of the welfare state, that we are getting this sudden increase of apprenticeships in the US. Despite that growth, apprenticeship remains at a fraction of the numbers in other countries. In the interest of time, I won't go into all of my ideas on how apprenticeships might be the answer to AI job dislocation, at least in America. But for those of you who are thinking this is a very technocratic answer, I'll just leave you with this. This is Cory McCray. He's a state senator from Maryland. He recently wrote a memoir that talks about how, as a teenager, he was getting into trouble. He had been held in juvenile detention. He seemed to be on a course towards more jail and a very different life. His mother said to him during that time, he has this line where she said, "I will keep believing in you until you start believing in yourself." I like that line because I feel that that's what my graduate advisors did for me. She was the one who got him hooked up with this apprenticeship. He turned his life around. He is now a senator in the Maryland State Senate. So if and when my work on apprenticeships ever gets published, the first person I'm sending it to is Senator McCray. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, we have lots of time for discussion. Thank you so much for your talk, Monica. So yeah, if people would like to ask questions, just raise your hand. I'll try and point to people as it comes, and we'll try and identify folks and get you a microphone. So I can see a hand in the middle here, and then we have a hand down here. So.
Hi, thank you. This was really wonderful. My name is Cassie Pittman-Clater, and I have a question about, whenever I hear unions, I often think racially exclusionary. Whenever I think about labor market outcomes, I think black unemployment, always double. And so I guess when you're thinking about problems that are interrelated, much more challenging, like I think you have, I don't know, it seems like, I guess let me get to the question. So this model presumes that everyone could have equal opportunity, but we've seen time and time again, even when we have universalistic policies, particularly marginalized people are excluded. And so how do you prevent that? I guess that's my question. I think in general, a lot of complex problems are layered. And so I do think this approach is helpful, but we have to also make sure when we describe what the problem is, that also has to be perhaps coming from many different perspectives as well.
Yeah, no, it's a fabulous question, and I have a couple of different thoughts about that. So one is that this whole thing with apprenticeships in the U.S., it kind of starts under President Obama. So he is trying to do this universal program. He doesn't manage to get it going, but they do kick off this long sequence of trying to experiment on a smaller scale with this, right? They, at least the Obama administration, is very, very concerned with exactly this question that you've brought up about the historical marginalization of people from apprenticeships. And they are trying to put in place ways to ensure that these things do benefit everyone. So one is that I do think that, out of difficult histories we have learned things, right? And so we can try to do things differently than how they were done in the past. The other thought that I had is that is much more cynical. This is really about trying to buy off a set of people who have indicated to us, who have made it very clear to us that if their concerns are not addressed, they're going to make life difficult for everyone. So this is just a very, bribing is the right word, right? It's really about trying to get this set of people to accommodate to what is happening to globalization. So.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question here, and then other hands, show me, and we'll come to you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Emma, and I am from Hungary, and I think I was really interested in your first kind of statement that you wanted to look into populism in the US, and that's how you got into, I guess, economic structures and job loss and all of this. And I do wonder to what extent you think the kind of problem solving you're sketching here can be applied to other areas of the world other than the US, and maybe even regions such as Eastern Europe, which obviously has a really specific history with communism and so on. But I just mentioned that I'm Hungarian because obviously we had the elections a week ago and quite amazing results. But I do wonder at the same time how does democracy fits into this, or how does into your theory or problem solving or modern democracy and all of that, or just linking back to your original problem statement on populism, how will apprenticeships save us from that, or do you think they will actually? And so yeah, two questions applicable to other contexts, and just to link back to democracy and the populism problem. Thank you so much.
Yeah, two great questions. So definitely, this is not just about the U.S. In fact, our Center on Global Poverty is trying to do this about other countries as well, and it's kind of problem solving. And then, that's I guess that's sort of what's implicit in the question about democracy is that, is this non-democratic, right? Is this something, sociologists sitting here saying this is what ought to be done? So, I mean, the way I think about it is that luckily sociologists have no power. So if anything is to come of this, it has to be in participation with other groups, right? So all we have is the power to make arguments that are or are not convincing to others. So it must be in concert with a broader democratic coalition.
And on the follow-up question I was interested in is, how do you see this connected to the problem of populism? If they had managed to use this kind of mechanism of bribery,
Right.
Is the claim that we would see less populism in the United States?
That is the claim, yeah. So I mean, populism, there have been all of these studies of it, and I think you can basically distill it into three factors, right? So one are these demographic factors that result in different kinds of tensions, aging societies, migration, all of that is there, right? Then there is technology, right? These new technological innovations that are allowing people to find others who think like them, so these technological factors. And the third is economic, right? Economics is definitely part of it, right? It may not be the entire story. One meta-analysis I saw recently is suggesting that it's about a third of the story, right? So a third of the variation in the vote can be explained by economic factors. So I think about it as part of the story, but also I think about it as the part of the story that we all want to do something about. We don't want to prevent migration, or not all of us want to prevent migration or demographic change, right? We maybe want to regulate technology, but we do all want everyone who has lost a job to get some sort of compensation, to be adjusted, right? So that's the piece of it that I think is kind of least controversial for us to try to address.
Yeah, great. Other questions? So there's one at the back up there, and another one coming. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to try to formulate this clearly, but basically, I guess, what do you then see as the difference between sociology and kind of just policy making? Because I guess in a way I really agree with the idea of problem solving, but I think what I find exciting and interesting about sociology is its capacity for imagination and for kind of trying to exit somewhat the capitalist realist, like this, there's no alternative, this is what it has to be. Historically, we've seen, maybe we can have apprenticeships because it's hard to have universal basic income, for example, but I guess what's nice sometimes about sociology is to be like, well, but when we have done it, it does work in small places, or people do all these kinds of like mutual aid and other forms of resistance, and maybe we can look away from the state and maybe, and sure, that doesn't look like practical, reasonable problem solving, but I also see that as problem solving. So I guess, yeah, I'm wondering what is distinctively sociological about what you're presenting as opposed to kind of robustly sociologically nourished policymaking in the world as it is? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. There are a lot of smart people in the world who are trying to solve problems, right? What I think sociologists can add to this effort is to bring what we know as sociologists. So we know things about how how organizations work or how networks work, and these are things that we might be able to translate into this effort to formulate policies to solve problems. Conversely, I think that this effort to solve problems can also feed back into sociology, and can be a way to trouble sociology, to criticize it a little bit, to shake it up a little bit from, perhaps somewhat conservative influences. So I think it goes both ways. And in the book, I have lots of examples of sociologists who have managed to do this kind of thing. If you think of Erin McDonnell, she studies corruption in developing countries, and she's tried to show how if you actually try to solve corruption, you get into these very interesting questions of organizational culture. She's able to feed this back into a dialogue with Weber, basically, right? So moving the sociological question forward at the same time that you're moving the practical question forward. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you that I think we need to be careful not to restrict ourselves when we do problem solving to only trying to solve small practical questions. We must always continue to be creative about, well, can we actually imagine an alternative to capitalism? So I think I mentioned that when people haven't read the book, they talk about problem solving as this like narrow technocratic thing. And there's something about the words problem and solving that makes people think it's very narrow. But basically what I'm trying to say is that it's an approach. If you think that the solution is overthrowing capitalism, give us a rigorous route to that. Like, what does the path look like? How do you get more labor organization, right? What are the factors that lead to more union organizing, right? Or what are the different routes to what you see? So it's just about it's an approach about trying to provide empirically grounded arguments about social change, whatever the scale of that change.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Ali, yeah.
I'm a bit confused about the conclusion about, to whom we should be offering concessions. Was that correct use of whom? To whom we should offer concessions?
Say this again?
Because, I'm reminded of, Du Bois is a prototypical problem-solving sociologist, and in his early work, he looked at an era where we gave concessions to white workers in the post-Reconstruction era. And the byproduct of giving concessions towards these folks was that you get a whole new regime of racial terror through the black codes, through exclusionary unions that we've already heard about. And I know that you can't necessarily transpose from 1900 to 2026, but there is an element there of concessions towards certain people often just reproduce the same layers of inequality which other sociologists would classify as being central problems to begin with. Who was the guy that wrote that book, Dying of Whiteness? You know it, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Metzl.
Yeah, Dying of Whiteness is another example of that, which is much more recent, where they show that actually when you make concessions towards certain groups, you might maintain a status quo, but if you make concessions for other groups who are seen to be, the properly subalternized or, damned of the earth, wretched of the earth within a society, then all hell breaks loose, right? Like people were literally voting against their interests because they saw people below them getting concessions which were actually also benefiting the people above them. So yeah, I guess I'm just a bit confused about the conclusion, but it could just be because I was maybe not following it completely. It
Yeah,
could be a me problem.
No, I see your point, but I'm not sure I agree with the counterfactual. So you're saying that had we given adequate compensation and adjustment to people who had lost their jobs due to free trade, it would have resulted in reproducing a sort of racial status quo. On the analogy of to Du Bois, right?
Yeah, I don't know who the group are that we're giving concessions to.
So we're giving concessions to the people who lose their jobs because of the China shock. This import competition, right? And so, one thing is that it's a racially diverse group. So, there's some lovely historical scholarship on this question about, showing that it's not just the white working class, but it is the white working class, them as well, right? So, it's a question of what we mean by giving concessions. We're not giving concessions to say, go be racially supreme, right? That's the kind of concession that you're talking about. We're giving concessions to say, you've been damaged economically in this way, and we're going to try to do something about that damage. So that's the way I see it, but this is a really interesting discussion that we should continue as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone, so far. I think, one at the front here.
Thank you, Professor. Just to follow up with Ali's question over there, I think the development economics parlance would be unintended consequences, just to follow up on the few previous questions. If we were to give concessions of these sorts and then people have particular reactions to it, which could be in realms outside of the economic, it could be in social, cultural, or any other realms, how does this framework account for those quote-unquote unintended consequences or the problems that arise from this? I'm asking this out of context also that I worked in public policy previously before coming into academia. And always is that like when the common sense was that within bureaucrats you solve one problem, you always account for the 5 other problems that will emerge because of that. And I think sociology has had this, perhaps this difficulty of, or perhaps is in a position to account for this difficulty. But how do we put that within sociological frameworks?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So, the comparison I'm working with is this, Gordon Otter, David Otter, Gordon Hansen, David Dorn argument, right? Comparing the people who were exposed to the China shock and those who weren't. The ones who weren't did not vote in such extreme ways. But you're asking this super interesting question of, well, okay, let's say we had passed these policies. Let's say the Tariff Commission had not been so intransigent, and these workers had therefore gotten these concessions, etc. Would that have solved all the problems, or could something else have happened? Like what would have gone wrong? I mean, the short answer is I'm sure there would have been unintended consequences of some kind. There wouldn't have been these specific consequences, right? We would have had less extreme politicians. We would have had instead of Trump, we would have had Mitt Romney. And actually, your question is a good one because I remember I was so unprepared for populism that in 2012, I remember I was so outraged at Mitt Romney for exaggerating the benefits of capital gains tax cuts. I thought, how can you just stand up in front of everybody and lie like that, right? And so that's what we would have had. We would have had the continuation of that kind of, tax cut kind of populism, which is also populism. And, I would have been as upset about that as I am about populism now. So.
Great, thank you. Oh, great, wonderful. So we have one at the back up here. Let's do that. We'll have this one here, and then we've got in the middle as well, yes. So we'll still do them one at a time, but just to get the order.
Sure, sir. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I'm here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of your work is based on the idea that the people who are affected by kind of labor market changes. So it's really coming from economics and looking at the trade shocks victims, and that's a very economic argument. There are other people, I don't want to talk about my book, but I've done work on the quality of work and how much that also affects kind of the populist drive. Also financial insecurity, so people are not in work, that we don't really focus on, because at the moment the focus of economy is really on the kind of male sort of sources, the sources of the issues that men really focus on work and the recognition of work, but there's also a lot of other people who are voting for populists that are not. So how much of this comes from the economists? How much, because the economic perspective is that if you have a job and if you lose your job, that's going to be the main issue that we need to address as a state. But I think the sociological or social policy perspective is that we also need to care about the quality of work, because that's a fundamental drive of the populist surge, and we know that. So I'm curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, I just discovered your book, if you are who I think you are. And it's a new perspective to me, so I've been very curious about it. I want to introduce you to my colleague Rina Agarwala, who is also thinking about insecurity in this way. But yeah, you're right. This is coming out very much out of this very economistic perspective about having or not having a job. I mean, it's not just that. It's also that the people who lost their jobs, sometimes they could get a job, but it just wasn't as good a job as the one that they had lost. So that perspective is also there. But yeah, it's coming out of this set of debates that has been happening over the last 10 or 12 years.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this really interesting, I wouldn't say eye-opening talk. I could see a lot, I can see a lot of aspects where problem-solving sociology would be useful. I could see a lot of criticism, which are probably addressed in your book, so I'll read it. I'd rather like to shift the question a little bit. What about we think about this as a question of division of labor? And I'm not talking here about field level. Some people should do that, other people should do that. That's a possibility, but that would be going back to the pastors' quadrants to a certain extent at the population level of sociologists. I was rather thinking, if you think of individual trajectories, can you at some point, start doing problem solving and then move into more blue sky, fundamental research, or the skills that you need to do one are somewhat antithetical, or the structure of opportunity within the discipline, the incentives, etc., is different. And I was thinking of your past work, your books. Would for instance Monica Prasad, who wrote that wonderful book on the free markets, could have become Professor Prasad had she been into problem solving, in her first years?
That was a totally problem-solving book. I was trying to solve the problem of why the U.S. was not like Europe.
But it's also very fundamental as a question. It was not trying to, you know your work better than I do, of course. But that's not how I read it, okay.
Yeah. No, it's a fabulous question. So the question basically is, can you make a career in sociology by just doing problem solving? This is something that I discuss in the last chapter of the book, because it's a very vital question for young scholars. And so I think there's a possibility of finding problems that are so fundamental that everyone in the discipline agrees that they're a problem, right? Like the question of why isn't there a welfare state in the U.S., right? But two, I also talk about how trying to solve a problem can bring you to a point where you haven't solved it, but you're discovering something that other people don't know, and that's a point. I talk about what are the points where you should try to stop solving a problem. And that's a point where you should actually stop trying to solve a problem and publish that. Because if it's something that people don't know, you should get that out into the world. And I wouldn't consider that a failure. In fact, I would consider that a success of problem solving, because you reached that insight by trying to solve the problem. And I give this example of someone for whom that happened, Margot Mahan at the University of Michigan. She was trying to solve the problem of domestic violence, right? And so she through the course of researching domestic violence laws, she discovered that these domestic violence laws are rooted in a white supremacist history. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it definitely teaches you something that sociologists don't know. And so that's why I say that this very practical attempt is very tightly tied to the intellectual attempt. Moving forward in this direction always moves you forward in this direction, even if you don't solve the problems.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Monica. I come back to this one graph you showed with low apprenticeship in the United States compared to Europe, and I wonder that, I mean, from a comparative political economy perspective, whether you do not need the notion of institutional complementarities to explain this. So what I want to say by this is the explanation of why you observe this difference might not be, I mean, political or whatever, unfairness, but it might lay in the structural composition of the economy and how parts relate to each other. And the second point refers to the actual effects of compensation. And I mean, when you are in Germany, then you certainly have, I mean, you have a corporatist country, and there's a lot of compensation. And the area which always sticks out there is the Ruhr area in Germany, where all the heavy industry was. Yeah. And there were billions and billions invested in compensation on different levels. Now the result is, I mean, the Ruhrgebiet looks different from Pittsburgh or Detroit, but it's still, I mean, not in all dimensions, a happy place. And when you ask sociologists who work on this, then they point to a cultural issue which can be difficult to compensate. So people cherish certain life worlds, yeah, and cultures that are associated with certain industries, and to change. I mean, there's a conservatism in this, and money doesn't change this. Yeah, so you have in the Ruhrgebiet, you have people who are simply used to work for these huge companies, yeah, with whatever comes with it, and to make them entrepreneurial, small-scale entrepreneurs is a cultural shift which they're not willing to often, at least, not willing to take. Yeah, so all I want to say here is that compensation probably can only do that much, and we have a conflict here between the dynamism of an economic system with the conservatism of an everyday life.
Yeah, fascinating question. I will just mention that trade adjustment assistance wasn't necessarily about compensating individual workers. It was also about trying to help firms and industries, and there are some people who discuss this who think that it should be more about trying to revive communities. So compensation should be at a sort of a geographic level like that. There was also, I guess you didn't quite ask this question, but there is a question about, well, how should we think about the fact that there's populism in Europe too, right? Despite this. But I think they're not really comparable. So one is the American form of this has just taken a much more protectionist incarnation than the European has, and also the Europe story is, I think, very different from the American story. So there's this kind of self-inflicted wound of austerity politics in Europe, which we didn't have in the U.S. We were doing stimulus while Europe was doing austerity. There's the migration flows are much more significant in Europe, so I think you can't really compare Europe and the U.S. on these questions in general. And then, your question was about varieties of capitalism and institutional complementarities. So my read of that literature is that the more recent literature in comparative political economics, the growth models literature, et cetera, finds that varieties of capitalism ignores issues like the power constellations that keep these different institutions in place. And personally, I find that a little bit more convincing because of this bipartisan rise in apprenticeships in the US. That said, you are absolutely right that it's still very, very low. So I feel one reason I'm intellectually excited about this apprenticeship thing in the US is because it is kind of a test between the varieties of capitalism and the growth models kind of perspective. You know, is it really, if varieties of capitalism is right, apprenticeships are not going to go very far. If the growth models and the power coalitions kind of argument is right, then apprenticeships will rise. So I guess we'll see. I feel like I didn't quite get the import of the second question. So if you want to rephrase it, or
Let's go.
Okay, we can talk later.
Yeah, we can come back to that. It was about, I think, the dynamism of the economy juxtaposed against the conservatism of the life world of people. But let's have the yellow shirt in the middle there, and then afterwards purple shirt down in the middle here as well. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I just had a question about the proposed solutions to the apprenticeships. I don't know about the age structure of apprenticeship take-up in the US, but my suspicion is that the people who tend to lose their jobs through trade disruption tend to be mid-career or older. And apprenticeship take-up, at least in the UK context, is something that people do straight out of school. So I was just wondering about whether this is about compensating the children of the people who've lost their jobs, and that seems, perhaps solving an unemployment problem for them. But it doesn't seem, at least from my perspective, to be a direct compensation to those people who have lost their jobs, unless older people are taking them up.
Yeah, no, it's definitely harder for older workers. There have been different kinds of policies. So, for example, the kinds of things that they tried to experiment with is workers over 50. They would do things like do a top-up subsidy. So, you could find some other job that isn't paying as much as you're getting. So they would kind of try to top it up a little bit. Yeah, no, definitely. It's always kind of interesting to me, given my age now, to see them talk about the older workers who are completely we can't do anything about them. So, but I think there are models that we can do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really wanted to ask something very similarly. I want to know more about apprenticeships. I wanted to know about the age solidarity that it might cause, or the lack of age solidarity. Because you kept saying that it's bipartisan and it seems like everyone can get behind it, but wouldn't this create a whole division between ages? And don't we already have enough of that? And what would this be doing?
So the idea is that because younger people are getting apprenticeships.
Yeah, they might be getting more apprenticeships now, and then there might be more older people taking those apprenticeships. And there might be some competition that might, undercut the bipartisan nature.
No, it's a fascinating question, but I feel that there already is this age competition. People complaining about not being able to purchase homes. The paper earlier in the session compared to their parents, right? So I think that's already there, and apprenticeships I see as kind of one thing that might actually help to heal that, or to overcome that in some ways.
Great. We have time for maybe one more if there was a question. If not, I will ask mine. I was just reflecting on lesson 1, beware state capacity. And I wondered whether it might be, another way of interpreting it would be to say, beware of policy conversion. And here I'm thinking about the sort of path dependency literature and thinking about the way in which the intention of the act was to try and create scope, right? But actually it got remade and converted into another kind of enterprise. And so the worry is perhaps not so much one interpretation is not so much state capacity, it's more about the scope within policy to avoid the process of conversion, allowing other actors to remake the purpose of the policy or moving it to areas that we perhaps didn't intend it to occupy.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the thing that I'm struck most by when I read the archival stuff is how much the Tariff Commission members felt that they could not do otherwise.
Yeah.
You know, and so towards I didn't talk about it so much, but towards the end of the 60s, there starts to be this political pressure on them to change their votes because, you know, it's not working, right? And they're so resistant about this, and they're so angry about this, and, you know, they feel about this, I guess, you know, as academics would feel if there were pressure from the administration to hire people that they don't want to hire, right? They say, our ethic is to follow this rule. You know, so yeah, so I'm not sure. There definitely wasn't an intentional attempt to change the policy. There's something more interesting going on about, you know, about expertise and sort of how this profession sees itself and what it means to be an ethical actor in this profession. Right?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I mean, before we final round of applause, let me just remind you that if you're joining us for the boat party this evening, we should leave kind of a bit before 8 o'clock and we'll wander down. So we have about an hour for the drinks reception now, but before that, just join me in thanking Professor Prasad.